The camping trip had been my idea. After the divorce, things between my son and me had felt strained. It wasn't his fault. How could it be? He was just 15, caught between parents who couldn't make things work. I could see the change in him, though. He'd grown quieter, less inclined to share the little things like he used to. I knew I had to do something before the distance between us became permanent. A weekend in the wilderness seemed like the perfect way to reconnect. No distractions, no phones, just us and nature. We left early Saturday morning, the SUV packed with all the essentials. Sleeping bags, a tent, a portable stove, and enough snacks to last us a week, even though we'd only be gone for 2 days. The drive was long but not unpleasant. We made small talk about school, his favorite video games, how he was doing with the new living arrangements. He seemed reluctant at first, answering in short sentences, but by the time we reached the dirt road that led into the forest, he'd opened up a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. The campsite I'd chosen was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour hike from where we parked the car. It was secluded, surrounded by towering pines and nestled near a clear, slow-moving river. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. As we set up camp, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. This was what we needed, a break from the noise and complications of everyday life. We spent the afternoon fishing by the river. Neither of us was particularly skilled at it, but we managed to catch a few small trout. My son laughed when I nearly fell into the water trying to reel one in, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a genuine smile on his face. That evening, we cooked the fish over the campfire and told stories. He even admitted he didn't mind being out here, away from his friends and Wi-Fi. It felt like we were finally on the same wavelength again. As the fire died down, we decided to call it a night. I set up our sleeping arrangements, 2 small tents a few feet apart, and double-checked that everything was secure. My son was already crawling into his sleeping bag when I sat by the dwindling fire for a while longer, staring into the embers. The forest was alive with sounds. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. It was calming, a far cry from the chaos of the city. I eventually climbed into my tent, the warmth of my sleeping bag a welcome reprieve from the cool night air. Just as I was drifting off, I heard footsteps circling the campsite. They were light and cautious. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. Still, I stayed awake for a while, listening, until the sound faded into the background noise of the forest. I managed to convince myself it was nothing and finally fell asleep. The next morning, over breakfast, my son asked, "Were you walking around last night?" I froze for a moment, trying to gauge his tone. He didn't sound scared, just curious. "No," I replied carefully. "Why?" He shrugged. "I thought I heard someone walking around. Probably just an animal, right?" I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, probably." We both laughed, though it felt a bit hollow. Still, we didn't dwell on it. There was no point in spooking ourselves over something so trivial. The day passed without incident. We hiked along the river, exploring the area and taking in the sights. My son found a small clearing filled with wildflowers and spent some time picking a few to press into a book he'd brought along. It was peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were different, quieter maybe, as if the usual hum of nature had been dialed down. I told myself I was imagining things. That evening, as we sat by the fire again, my son admitted he felt like we were being watched. I laughed it off, telling him it was just the isolation playing tricks on our minds. Deep down, though, I couldn't help but agree. There was something unsettling about the stillness. When we retired to our tents that night, I was more alert than the previous evening. I lay awake, listening, every small sound amplified in the silence. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps, heavier this time, moving slowly around the campsite. My breath caught as I listened. They stopped near my tent, replaced by a faint tapping against the fabric. I froze, my mind racing. I reached for my flashlight, hand trembling, and unzipped the tent just enough to shine the beam outside. Nothing. The forest was still, the campsite undisturbed. I checked my son's tent, finding him fast asleep. Telling myself it was nothing, I returned to my tent and tried to sleep, but the unease lingered. Morning brought sunlight and a sense of relief until I realized my son was gone. His tent was empty, his sleeping bag neatly rolled up as if he'd left intentionally. Panic set in as I called his name, my voice echoing through the trees. I searched the area, retracing our steps from the previous day, but there was no sign of him. When I returned to the campsite, exhausted and on the verge of despair, I found the note. It was on old, crumpled paper, the handwriting uneven and jagged. My stomach turned as I read the first line. "If you want your son back, follow these rules." My hands shook as I read the rules, each one more bizarre and terrifying than the last. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had left the note? And why? I sat there, the note still clutched tightly in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of the bizarre, impossible rules it outlined. My stomach twisted, but there was no denying it. This was the only lead I had, the only thread that might bring my son back. I had to follow the rules, no matter how insane they seemed, no matter how much dread clawed at me from the pit of my stomach. I glanced around the campsite again, but everything appeared unchanged, normal, as if nothing had happened at all. Yet, my son was gone, and a sense of unease had settled so deeply in my bones that I could feel it pressing against my chest. The forest stood silent around me, the faint murmur of the river nearby now seeming distant, almost irrelevant. I stood up, the note still in my hand, and walked to the edge of the clearing, where my son had been sitting just hours earlier. His wildflowers, carefully pressed into a book, were still there, but everything felt wrong. The calm, serene atmosphere was gone, replaced with a sharp, unsettling tension. I took a deep breath and scanned the trees. Nothing moved, nothing made a sound. I was alone. I unfolded the note again, reading the first rule one more time. 1. At exactly midnight, sit silently outside and close your eyes. You will hear something move around your campsite in circles. Do not move or open your eyes until the sound is gone. I tried to steady my breathing. Midnight, that was hours away. I had time, but the thought of being so vulnerable, so exposed to whatever was out there, filled me with dread. What would happen if I failed? What if the thing circling the campsite wasn't an animal? The note had said to do nothing. My thoughts raced, each one darker than the last, but I had no choice. I had to try. There was no other way to get my son back. The sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky transforming into a deep shade of purple, the moon rising high above the trees. I thought of the second rule, too. Do not eat or drink anything, even if you are starving or thirsty. Accepting nourishment here before seeing your son means it will accept your son as nourishment. I felt the ache in my stomach as I read those words. This rule seemed like a joke. The hunger gnawing at me had been there since the moment I'd realized my son was missing. I hadn't eaten or drunk anything since breakfast, but now the thought of food seemed almost unbearable. How could I possibly refuse? How could I sit there with an empty stomach when I wasn't even sure if I would survive this night? The temptation was almost overwhelming, but I knew if I wanted to bring my son back, I couldn't risk it. I had to ignore my body's desperate cravings. I stuffed the note back in my pocket, forcing my mind away from the hunger. The light from the fire flickered in the growing darkness, casting long shadows across the trees. The third rule appeared in my mind: 3. If you hear knocking on the trees, knock back exactly 3 times. If the knocking stops, you are safe. If it continues, run to the river and submerge your hands until they go numb. Do not dry them off. I shuddered at the thought of the knocking. How could something knock on trees? What would it sound like? And if I heard it, would I know how to respond? My mind kept returning to that single word: run. Would I have enough time to reach the river if it came to that? And what did it mean to have numb hands? To not dry them off? It felt like I was being asked to follow a string of impossible instructions, each more horrifying than the last. But I couldn't afford to question it. The rules were clear. As I stood there, contemplating the strange and unsettling directions, I glanced over at the fire, its glowing embers now casting eerie flickers in the surrounding darkness. The fourth rule stood out to me now: for during the night, you will feel something crawl into your sleeping bag, its weight pressing against you, its breath close to your ear. Do not flinch, do not speak, and do not move, no matter how long it lingers. It is testing your resolve. If you fail, your son will be taken forever, and so will you. I ran my hands through my hair, trying to control the rising panic. I couldn't imagine it. Something crawling into my sleeping bag, breathing right next to me. I had to stay perfectly still, no matter how terrified I was. How could I do that? The image of my son's face, smiling as we fished together by the river, filled my mind. I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let it happen. I checked the time on my watch, still several hours before midnight. I still had time to process the rest of the rules, to prepare myself for the worst. 5. You may see your son standing at the edge of the clearing, silently watching you. Do not approach him. Instead, speak these words: stay strong. I am coming. If he responds, do not listen to what he says. If he moves closer, retreat into your tent and lock it. That is not your son anymore. This rule made my heart ache. I could see it so clearly in my mind. My son, standing there in the dark, waiting for me, but it wouldn't be him. Not really. The thought of losing him forever, of seeing him like that, filled me with dread. But there was no choice. If I saw him, I had to keep my distance. Rule 6. On the night you dream of your son coming back to you, you must try wake yourself up. This is your only chance to save him. Use your bare hands to gather ash from the still burning fire and mark his initials outside your tent. If the fire goes out or you hesitate, the dream will stay as a dream. If done correctly, he will return to you soon after. The final rule left a bitter taste in my mouth. Dreaming of my son, him returning to me. How could I not go to him in that moment? How could I wake up, knowing I might miss the chance to hold him again, to bring him back? But I couldn't let that moment slip away. The only chance I had to save him was to follow these rules. And it would all come down to the smallest of actions. I took a deep breath, looking around the campsite one last time, steeling myself for what I knew I had to do. The night stretched on, and the forest seemed to close in on me. As the sky deepened into inky blackness, I found myself pacing around the campsite, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. The rules, the damn rules. How was I supposed to follow them? My heart hammered in my chest, every rustle of the wind against the trees making my skin crawl. It was as though the very forest was alive, watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I forced myself to sit by the fire, the flames crackling and spitting, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to take on strange, almost human shapes. The smoke swirled around me, filling my lungs with its acrid scent, and I realized with a jolt that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. The hunger gnawed at me again, sharp and insistent, but I crushed the thought before it could take root. I wasn't going to break that rule. Not now. I glanced at my watch. It was almost midnight. My throat tightened, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had read the first rule over and over in my mind, trying to prepare myself for what was to come. Sit outside, close your eyes, and don't move. But what would happen if I did move? The thought made my stomach churn. I'd heard rumors of strange things happening in the woods, people disappearing, things that couldn't be explained, but I never thought I'd be the one to experience it. The usual chirping of crickets and croaking of frogs had stopped. I stood, my legs stiff from sitting too long, and moved toward the campfire, casting one last glance over my shoulder at my son's empty tent. My heart clenched, but I pushed the thought away. I had to stay focused. At exactly midnight, I sat down outside my tent, my eyes never leaving the flickering flames as I closed them, willing myself to remain calm. My pulse drummed in my ears, each beat a loud reminder that I was no longer alone in these woods. The first noise came, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. I had a feeling that it was just the wind rustling the leaves, but then it came again, a distinct footstep. Slow, deliberate steps came, moving in a circle around the campsite. My breath caught in my throat, my heart racing as the sound grew louder. It was unmistakable. Someone or something was out there. I remained as still as I could, my eyes squeezed shut, refusing to open them no matter how badly I wanted to see what was making the noise. The footsteps circled, always just out of sight, never revealing themselves. My palms were sweating, the tension in my body nearly unbearable. I could hear the sound of my own breath, shallow and quick, mixing with the rustling of the leaves. The footsteps continued their endless, deliberate circuit. Then they stopped, just outside the ring of light cast by the fire. The silence was so thick it frightened me even more. I couldn't hear anything except my own heartbeat, thudding in my chest. And then there it was, a faint tapping. It came from the direction of the trees, soft at first, then louder, more insistent. 3 taps, spaced just far enough apart to make my blood run cold. The sound was exactly like someone knocking on wood, rhythmic and deliberate. My pulse skipped a beat, and I forced myself to respond, remembering the 3rd rule. I knocked back 3 times, my hand trembling with fear. The echo of my knocks seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, but nothing happened. The knocking continued, relentless, coming closer. I froze. The knocking didn't stop. Without thinking, I bolted. My mind screamed at me to move, to get to the river, to follow the next rule before it was too late. My feet were moving faster than ever, as panic tightened in my chest. The knocking seemed to follow me, getting louder with every step, until it was right behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning, but I didn't dare look back. The river came into view, its slow-moving waters reflecting the pale light of the moon. I stumbled down the bank, tripping over rocks and roots, until I reached the edge of the water. The moment I submerged my hands in the cold river, I felt the shock of the temperature, the numbing cold seeping up my arms. But I didn't dare pull them out. I kept them submerged, waiting, listening. The knocking had stopped, thank God. My hands were growing numb, but I couldn't dry them off. I didn't dare. I stayed there for what felt like hours, hands submerged, until the numbing cold began to creep up my arms, forcing me to stay in the water. The river was relentless, its icy grip making it harder to stay still, but I had to. I had no choice. I didn't dare risk disobeying any of the rules. Finally, after a long time, I pulled my hands from the water, trembling uncontrollably. The moment I did, the weight of the night settled back around me, the forest growing unervingly silent once again. I stood there, staring at my dripping hands, trying to steady my breath. But as I turned back toward the campsite, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the clearing, standing perfectly still, was a figure. A dark shape, barely visible in the moonlight, watching me. It stood there, unmoving, its presence like a black hole, pulling at the very air around it. For a moment, I thought it was my son until I remembered the fifth rule. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my heart pounding. I had to speak the words, no matter how much it tore at me. I forced myself to take a deep breath, my voice barely a whisper, the words barely leaving my lips. Stay strong. I am coming. The figure didn't move. It didn't even acknowledge me, but I could feel its presence. Heavy, oppressive, as though it was drawing closer. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and bolted back to my tent, locking the zipper behind me. I lay there, trembling in the darkness, every muscle in my body tense with fear. My mind raced, thinking of the final rule, wondering if I would even get a chance to dream of my son, if I would have a chance to wake myself up in time. I lay there in the dark, my breath still shallow and erratic, trying to calm my racing heart. My hands were still cold from the river, but the fear, the immediate terror, had ebbed just enough to let me breathe for a moment. The rules weighed heavily on me, but as I lay in the tent, I found my mind drifting, unable to fully fight the exhaustion. I closed my eyes, the events of the night replaying over and over in my head, my thoughts clashing with the rules, wondering what the next step would bring. The forest was eerily quiet now. The wind had picked up, but it was a soft, almost soothing breeze, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wet earth. The air no longer felt oppressive, though my nerves remained on edge. I could hear the distant rustling of branches, the occasional chirp of a night bird, and the soft, rhythmic flow of the river. It almost felt like I was safe again, almost as if the horrors of the night had momentarily receded. I let out a long, shaky breath, allowing myself to sink deeper into the sleeping bag. My eyes fluttered closed, the cold and the fear starting to lose their grip on me. The warmth of the bag wrapped around me like a protective cocoon, and for a fleeting moment, I almost felt normal. It had been hours since I last checked my watch, but I didn't dare now. I needed rest, needed some semblance of peace before the next rule came to demand my attention. But it was fleeting. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of the knock again. Came soft at first, like the tap of a distant drum. I flinched at the sound, my muscles tensing involuntarily, but I forced myself to remain still. There was no more running, no more disobeying. I remembered the rule: do not flinch, do not speak. "Do not move." My chest was tight, my mind screaming to break the rule, to get up and flee, but I resisted. The tapping came again, and this time it was louder, closer. It was right outside the tent, its rhythm slow and deliberate. 3 taps, 3 soft, ominous taps. I stayed as still as possible, my heart hammering in my chest, a cold sweat forming on my brow. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, stretching on far too long. I waited, every fiber of my being screaming for me to react, to do something. But I kept my eyes tightly shut, breathing slowly, remembering the rules. And then the tapping started again. This time, however, it wasn't from outside. It was coming from inside the tent. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip open the zipper and run out, but I forced myself to stay still. The tapping came from the corner of the tent, a rhythmic, methodical sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something else. Something that had no business being here. Something that should have stayed out in the woods, far away from the campsite. I wanted to look. I had to know what was making the sound, but I couldn't open my eyes. I couldn't break the rules. My breathing became more erratic, and my mind raced in panic. What was it? What could it possibly be? The tapping continued, and then it stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Maybe it was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe I had finally cracked. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I could feel it like a weight in the air. The tension in the tent thickened, the silence becoming unbearable. Something was in here with me. Then the softest whisper. "Don't look." The voice was barely audible, but it came from just beside me, from the dark corner of the tent. I could feel the breath, warm and damp, against my ear, but my body refused to move, to react. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my whole body tense with the overwhelming urge to disobey the rules. But then the whisper came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Don't look, not yet." I knew then that whatever was out there, whatever was causing all this, wasn't just following the rules. It was playing with me. It wanted me to break them. And if I did, I didn't want to think about the consequences. Another breath, closer this time, right next to me. I could feel the presence of something beside me, just out of my reach. It pressed against the fabric of the tent, making the air thick and hard to breathe. My mind screamed at me to open my eyes, to see what it was, but I knew I couldn't. I had to wait. I had to follow the rules. The weight beside me shifted, and I could hear its breathing now, ragged and shallow, in time with my own. I clenched my fists, praying that it wouldn't get closer, that it would just go away. But the tension was unbearable. The breath on my ear, the whispers in the dark, the tapping in the distance. It was all too much. I couldn't take it anymore. And then, as if reading my thoughts, it spoke again, the voice dark and cold. "You think you can survive this? You think the rules will save you?" A cold rush of fear washed over me, as if something had broken through the invisible wall I had tried to keep intact. My heart began to race, and the whispers grew louder, more mocking. The entity, or whatever it was, seemed to be playing some sick game with me. The tent seemed to shrink around me, the space growing impossibly tight, like I was trapped in some invisible vice. Couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The whispers came faster, louder, as if the very air was pressing against me, suffocating me. I couldn't think straight anymore. Every instinct screamed at me to break the rules, to open my eyes, to do something, but I had to follow the rules. I had to. But then, something else shifted. The presence, that suffocating feeling, began to pull back, retreating slightly, just out of reach. I didn't know if I was still obeying the rules or if it was letting me. But that brief moment of relief didn't last long. The air shifted again, the pressure returning. Something was closing in on me. The rules, the whispers, the sounds, they were no longer just things I had to follow. They were the only things standing between me and something far worse. And I knew it wasn't going to stop until I broke. The whispers continued to torment me, their taunts growing more twisted with each passing second. My heart raced, my breath shallow as the suffocating presence seemed to squeeze the air out of the tent. I didn't know how long I could last, clinging to the rules in the hopes that they would be my salvation. But doubt crept in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The presence felt too real, too powerful to be ignored. In the far distance, I heard a scream, not a human or animal-like scream. It was something else. Then all of a sudden, the presence in my tent followed the noise. I could hear the thing almost galloping, like it was moving on all fours at an incredible speed. I didn't want to be here anymore, but I knew that I had to do this for my son. I had to force myself to fall asleep so I could just get that dream of him coming back to me. I dreamt of him. I couldn't remember much, but I was awake now. I remembered what I had to do next. On the night you dream of your son coming back to you, you must try to wake yourself up. The words stuck in my head like a hammer striking an anvil. It was the last and perhaps most terrifying of all the rules. But if it worked, if I could pull it off, my son would be back. I would see him again and we would escape. But the cost, the price of the rule. I had to gather ash from the fire with my bare hands. My bare hands. The fire that was still burning, casting flickering shadows into the tent. The thought of it made my stomach twist. To put my hands in the fire, it seemed like madness, but it wasn't. It was the only way. I swallowed hard, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes as I gripped the edges of the sleeping bag. My hands trembled, cold from the water and fear. The pain of it was unimaginable, but I had no choice. If I hesitated, if I let the dream slip away, I'd never see my son again. Not in this world, not in any world. I turned my gaze to the fire, the flames dancing in the darkness just outside the tent. The heat seemed to reach out, whispering promises of torment, of suffering. I could feel it even from here, but I had to do this. I didn't even know if I was still obeying the rules, if I was still capable of following them in this fog of terror and exhaustion. But somehow, my body moved on its own accord, pushing me toward the fire, my feet stumbling as I crawled toward the burning embers. My breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick with the stench of fear and smoke. The fire crackled, the heat searing against my face as I reached for the ashes. They were still warm, still alive with heat, and I knew in that instant that touching them would cost me. My hands hovered above the glowing embers, trembling uncontrollably. I closed my eyes, my heart pounding in my chest as I gathered all the courage I had left. Then, with a raw, unthinking motion, I plunged my hand into the fire. The pain was instant. It seared through my skin, through my very bones, like 1,000 knives stabbing into me at once. I screamed, but the sound was muffled by the thick terror that had swallowed my mind whole. My fingers curled involuntarily, grasping at the hot ashes, feeling the burning grains bite into my flesh. I wanted to pull back, to escape the agony, but I couldn't. I had to do this. I had to save my son. I could feel the skin on my hand blistering, the sharp sting of raw pain cutting deeper with every second. I held onto the ashes, gripping them tightly in my scorched hand, the raw burn of it all threatening to make me black out. I gasped for breath, my vision swimming as I clutched the handful of ashes, my body trembling violently. The rules. I had to follow them. I had to mark his initials outside my tent. The thought was like a sharp knife to the chest. I could barely move. I felt as though I was going to collapse right there. But with one last surge of willpower, I crawled outside the tent, the pain in my hand nearly unbearable. I dropped to my knees, the cool night air a stark contrast to the fire still blistering in my palm. With the ashes, I shakily traced the initials, his name, on the ground beside the tent. The pain was so intense I could barely see straight, but I knew I had to finish it. I couldn't stop now. When I was done, I fell back into the dirt, my body exhausted, my hand burning in a haze of agony. I couldn't hold my eyes open anymore. The night was closing in, the sounds of the forest fading to nothingness as the world around me blurred. I didn't know how long I lay there, my breathing slow and ragged. The fire, the pain, the fear, they all began to drift into the background, like a dream I couldn't quite grasp. My eyes fluttered shut. The dream came, but it wasn't like the other dreams. It wasn't a nightmare. I was in a field, the grass soft beneath my feet, the sky clear and endless. And then I saw him, my son, his small figure standing in the distance, just beyond the edge of the field, his familiar smile lighting up the world around him. My heart leapt in my chest as I rushed toward him, my steps light and quick, no longer weighed down by fear or pain. "Papa," he said, his voice sweet and innocent, the way it always used to be. I stopped just in front of him, my breath caught in my throat. He was real. He was right there. The nightmare, the terror. It all faded into nothingness as I knelt in front of him, pulling him close. His warmth, his presence, it was everything. "I'm here," I whispered, my voice breaking. He smiled at me, his eyes sparkling with that innocent joy I had lost so long ago. But there was something else in his eyes now, a hint of something that I couldn't quite understand. And then I heard the whispers, soft at first, like a faint breeze rustling the trees. But they grew louder, more insistent. The world around us started to shift, the colors of the field warping and fading. "You woke up," the voice whispered. The figure of my son seemed to flicker, his smile fading into a faint, haunting shadow. "You broke the rule," it said, the voice no longer sweet, but cold. And then, everything shattered, the dream splintering apart as I jerked awake with a start. I gasped for air, my chest heaving with terror. But there, just outside the tent, standing in the moonlight, was my son. His eyes, wide and full of confusion, met mine as if he were seeing me for the first time in years. My heart pounded in my chest. He was here. He had come back. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I knew we had one last chance. The rules had been followed, the price paid, and now, finally, I could take my son in my arms and escape this nightmare. We left everything and ran to the car. As we sat in, my son gave me a puzzled look and I asked him if he was okay and what had happened to him. He looked even more confused and he said he couldn't remember anything. Relief washed over me as I realized nothing had happened to him. I had to act like nothing happened. I just asked him what he would want to eat and I said that I was starving. Everything seemed normal now. We would be together again. and we would leave the horrors of the forest behind us forever.